It was at the Bunker Hill Museum in Boston, Massachusetts, that I found this portrayal of a British Grenadier. I'm not entirely sure what world in which that is a British Grenadier from the 18th century, but it's certainly not this one. Let's begin with this strange, I'm not entirely sure what it is, cap that the soldier seems to be wearing. It's obviously an attempt to replicate either the mitre cap, which was falling, out of style around the time of the Boston Massacre. That's the time when they stopped using the old, 7 Years' War style mitre cap. So if you see it, if you see a mitre cap like that, of course, around the time of the Boston Massacre, yeah, that's actually quite accurate, because that's the time when they were changing over the uniforms to the fashion that we are more used to in the American War of Independence. It's either meant to be something like that, or it's meant to look like a bearskin cap. Either way, it doesn't really do justice to either of those styles. You can see by the other two pictures there, it looks nothing alike. It looks more like a black shako combined with a mitre cap combined. I'm not entirely sure, but it's a complete work of fiction there. Perhaps it may look rather accurate from, very, very far away, or if you're standing on a hill somewhere and you're looking at the Grenadiers with their bearskin caps advanced up the hill, you might not be able to tell, oh, that's fur. It may look something like that, but overall it's entirely inaccurate. On the front as well, we have what appears to be some sort of a cap badge. Rather than being the tin-plated, facing of the Duet Mondroy thing, the regular tin plate that we see on the front of these helmets, it wouldn't just be a round badge like that. I'm not entirely sure what that's meant to represent, really, because even the old mitre caps wouldn't have had a round badge like that on the front, so there isn't really even all that much I can say to judge the hat, because it's just blatantly wrong. There's nothing about it that is redeeming. And then we get met by the hair. As you can see, there's quite a lot wrong with this one. The hair is a strange sort of combination of a queue with a powdered wig that's hanging loosely down the man's neck, which is wrong on a few counts. First things first, powdered wigs would not have been worn by enlisted men, at least not in the Americas, during this time period. This is something that, I've prattled on about in a couple of videos now for a very long time, but the average enlisted man, not only could he not afford a powdered wig like that, but even if he could afford one, there's no reason to wear it in the field. It is the case, yes, that certain guards regiments in London, guarding the sovereign themselves, yes, they might be seen with those sorts of powdered wigs, but that's because they're not actually, campaigning in the field. The idea that they would be wearing wigs like this when they're actually having to go out into an action is completely nonsensical. Continuing on with that, it's being worn in a queue, which, if you have a white wig, to my knowledge at least, they would not normally come in that sort of loosely dangling down the neck style. Of course, they'd be curled at the side, they'd be a bit more fancy, I suppose you can say. So the queue there seems a bit off, given that it's a powdered wig. If it was just his regular hair rather than a wig, then yes, it would make sense for it to be worn in a queue, as that is how, of course, the men would normally be wearing their hair at this time period. Rather than wearing wigs, they would just be wearing their actual hair very long, queued down the back of the neck. Of course, that being said, even if this was the man's regular hair in the picture, it would still be inaccurate, as the man wearing, let's presume it's meant to look like a bearskin cap, as that's what the men would be wearing at this time, at this particular engagement. Even if the hair was accurate in that it was his actual hair and it wasn't a powdered wig, it's still being worn inaccurately, as the men, when you're wearing a bearskin cap, would tuck the queue actually up underneath the cap in a way to sort of keep it just firmly placed on the head. They wouldn't be dangling loosely below like that. Carrying rapidly onwards, you can see by the man's neck and going down the chest, there seems to be some sort of frills, as if the shirt itself is, one of those puffy shirts of a more genteel variety, leading down through the man's coat. I'm not entirely sure if that's what that is meant to look like, but it seems to be the case. That would also be wrong. The men would just be wearing, regular, more workman-style shirts with vests or waistcoat over top of them, that you wouldn't see this sort of showing through the coat as we see here. Carrying on from the shirt, it's somewhat related before we move on to the coat. The man isn't wearing a neck stock. A neck stock would be a bit of either horsehair or leather wrapped around the neck, either clasped or tied at the back. It really doesn't serve any practical purpose beyond keeping the soldier's head up and, it looks a bit nice on parade. It doesn't actually serve a practical purpose in the field. As you can see here, the man is not actually wearing one, and I imagine that the sergeant wouldn't be very happy about that. Moving on to the man's shoulders, as we make rapid progress through his uniform, we see on his left shoulder there is nothing to actually keep the cross belt attached, which normally there would be, it's sort of like an epaulette type thing, a bit of cloth with a button to keep one's cartridge box sort of fixed and attached to the body, so that way it cannot easily be lifted over the shoulder. In fact, the entire crossbelt system that he's wearing here, with a sort of, regimental badge in the center keeping the two belts together, is more of a Napoleonic invention as opposed to the American War of Independence. Early on in the American War of Independence, the sort of time period that we're talking about for the Battle of Bunker Hill, it would actually be the case that the cartridge box would be worn across the shoulder, the way that we have here, but the bayonet belt would actually be worn around the waist. This changed in the American War of Independence, but it was a bit of a later development that both of the belts would be worn across the chest. So, moving on to the coat itself, the buttons on them are just a bit off-center. They should be much closer to the center of the man's chest rather than out towards his arms the way that they are. The actual design of the buttons, we don't see anything particular about them. Usually, the button design would vary depending on the individual regiment. That's a very small issue, though. But the placing of the buttons is a lot more accurate to a 7 Years' War style coat, before they swapped over the earlier style uniforms, with them being so far out to the edges like that. As we continue on further down the man's body, we see something that's rather curious as far as mistakes or problems go, and that I don't actually see a lock on his musket. He's carrying it, as you can see, at the support arms, which that's good. He's doing that in a proper fashion, or at least a mostly proper fashion. His arm may have to be a little bit higher up, but that's a small concern. Normally, at the support arms, you carry in the crux of your arm, that's where you have the lock, and that's what's actually supporting the musket. That's what allows you to keep it up like that. We don't actually see a lock on this piece, which I'm sure we can say it's being completely covered up by the coat, but in that case, he's carrying it in a slightly improper fashion of his arm being over top of the lock rather than supporting it from underneath. In any case, continuing on, we also see something rather curious with the crossbelt, which is that the second one isn't there for a reason, it would appear. Now you can see the crossbelt going over the left shoulder would of course be there to support the cartridge box, which would be on the man's right hip, and of course, behind him, you can't see it here. But the crossbelt on his right shoulder would, assuming that we're late war, American War of Independence, or Napoleonic War setup here, the right shoulder crossbelt would be used to support the bayonet at the man's left hip. Now the bayonet here is on the man's left hip, but based on where the belts are going, you can see the bayonet scabbard, the frog, is not being supported at all by the belt. In fact, there isn't even a belt around the man's waist. It's just sort of loosely hanging there as if clipped onto the man's breeches, which doesn't really make any sense. What's more, the bayonet itself isn't in a frog, it's just the scabbard itself. Normally, the bayonet scabbards would be, in a piece of the belt, as you can see here in an example. They'd be stuck through that. It's called a frog, to keep the scabbard from breaking or from falling off, anything like that. Here, it's just sort of loosely hanging by some invisible force. The coat itself, you can see from the split being very low there, is, again, not properly cut. This is a bit more of a 7 Years' War style, where the coats would be closed the entire way down, except on the very bottom. Revolutionary War coats, you can notice, are a lot more open. They're meant to spread out, make the soldier, the man, look much wider than he is. Whereas here we see the coat, it divides, yes, but only just below the man's arm, very low down on the body. It should be a lot more split. As we slide even further down, see, there's no real problems with the man's breeches. I mean, there's no buttons, but that's, hardly a great concern. No real problems there. We finally reach the man's legs. Now, while this man is wearing gaiters, they're very difficult to actually see, which, in fairness, I suppose they would be difficult to see, as even on some reenactors, you can only really tell that they're wearing gaiters rather than very tall boots when you get really close to them. A lot of people assume that the reenactors are wearing boots. Yes, you can sort of see where the gaiter divides from the shoe. They are two separate units in this picture. But that being said, there is still something that's slightly off about the gaiters. That being, one, that there are no buttons along the side to keep them on. Now, of course, one of the man's legs here is turned away from the camera, so you can't actually see the buttons, which would be on the outside of the leg. But on the other one, I feel like we should be able to see buttons going all the way down the leg there, which we don't see any of them. Another thing, there are no garters around the man's legs, which would be, again, kept just around where the gaiters meet the breeches, which, of course, breeches don't go all the way down the leg. They sort of stop at the knee. The breeches, the gaiters would meet there at the leg. There would normally be a garter there to sort of fasten the gaiters to keep them affixed, to keep them tight around the leg. We don't see any sign of that here. That being said, of course, this is also around the same time period where men are transitioning from the long gaiters to the short gaiters. At least in the field, they would normally be wearing short gaiters. In fact, my own reenacting group just recently swapped over to using short gaiters in the field, as it's a bit more accurate. The long gaiters, as we see here, would be much more commonly seen on garrison duty or, on some sort of sentry duty. Well, I can't say all that much about the man's sleeves. They also look just to be wrong. The facings with the weird red arrow design there. The fact that the sleeves seem to carry on very far down the man's sleeve. They reach halfway up the man's forearm and aren't actually there's that weird slash of red going into them. Everything about the sleeves, it's just incorrect. I'm not entirely sure what it's meant to be inspired by, but that's not what sleeves in the American War of Independence looked like. In fact, it might be something of a 7 Years' War design, but I'm not entirely sure about that. I've never seen something quite like that. I'll put, again, a few examples around it here so you can see what it actually would have seemed to be. And lastly, finally we're able to finish all of this up. The bayonet, which, of course, the bayonet itself, looks fine. You can't quite tell that it's a triangular blade from here. That's a small issue. It does, however, seem to continue from the musket as one continuous unit. Rather than being a separate unit that is, of course, affixed to the musket, it seems to just be one continuous piece of steel, which, as you can see from, again, all of these other pictures of a proper bayonet affixed to a musket, that's not how they work. So again, something of a small issue, I guess, because you have to really be looking for it, but it's just completely off. Now, despite all of those terrible inaccuracies, I can't actually blame the museum itself, which is an excellent museum, just to throw that out there. We can't really blame the museum themselves for this inaccurate portrayal. And why? Well, I'm not entirely certain if this is a contemporary piece, but it is, as you can see off on the side there, a piece from the Anne S.K. Brown Military Collection, which is a specific collection of contemporary portrayals of soldiers from the 18th century. Because yes indeed, my friends, while there may be a great deal of farbbery and historical inaccuracies in the modern world, the annals of history itself are rife, are riddled with its corruption. Something which we shall see, I hope, in much greater detail in a few other videos that I have planned for the future. So until the next time, my dear viewers, I am and I shall remain your most humble and obedient of servants.